Hey YouTube! So, in this video, we're going to cover yo-yos that kind of had fitment issues. So I just received this yo-yo today. This is the ACO Gravitation 3. And if you notice, if I try to tighten the yo-yo, you're gonna notice that it's slightly crooked and it starts to get really tight, like really difficult to tighten. You should never force tighten your yo-yo because most likely you'll probably damage something. It could either be a manufacturer defect, or it could be just a bad batch, or your yo-yo was just defective. But in this case, sometimes there are things that might remedy it. So the very first thing I usually look for is the bearing seat. I usually look for tiny little flakes of aluminum. So usually if you're mass producing a lot of yo-yos, a lot of companies might not be able to clean every one down to the very flake of aluminum. So I usually do is get a dry paper towel and I try to just wipe around to make sure that there's no aluminum flakes. I'll do the same to the other yo-yo. Make sure to keep all your parts in a pretty relatively safe location. You don't want to lose these tiny parts like your axle or your bearing. So you'll carefully remove your bearing with a bearing remover. I usually try to do a kind of circular motion, so it slowly shifts its way around until it gets off of the seat. And next I'll try to inspect the bearing, because sometimes you might have some type of aluminum flakes trapped in. So you might notice right there's a tiny piece of aluminum on my middle finger, but it's barely noticeable. I'll inspect the other yo-yo's bearing seat as well, so I think there's a little bit of aluminum. I'll just wipe it off. So now that you've done that, usually this cleaning, it takes only a few minutes. It's not really any type of modification. So what I usually do is I'll reassemble the yo-yo but without the bearing to see if the threads were actually damaged or not. And usually you could tell from right when you slightly tighten it. So then once everything looks like it is lined up, so that kind of tells me that the threads and the shaft is fine, I'll try to reassemble the yo-yo. And right now I'm noticing that even after the cleaning, it doesn't feel secure. It may look like from this video, it may look like everything's all tightened, but it's actually, I can probably tighten it a little bit more, but I'm not going to force it because I have a feeling that there's something else that's wrong with it. So knowing that there might be something wrong aside from just cleaning it out, there's a very high chance that the bearing seat itself is slightly bigger than the inner diameter for that bearing. Once I find out that the shaft is straight and the threads are fine, usually more or less it's that bearing seat. So let's get prepared. I got a scratch paper here. I have a damp paper towel. I'll explain that later. Make sure to keep all of your shaft and bearing in a very secure place because you're going to be a little bit more involved in this from here on in. And I have sandpaper. So I believe this one is 150 or 250 grit. For me, usually the finer grit allows you to more finely tune it. And obviously right here, there's an issue with the bearing just trying to fit in. And for most yo-yos, it's pretty snug, but this is like excessively snug. So what I'll do is I'll take a sandpaper. Just be warned that from here on in, you are taking your own risk at doing this. I'm very comfortable with doing this because this isn't the first time. And it has fixed all of my yo-yos that has the same issue. What I'm doing is I'm actually sanding down that bearing seat just enough where I'm taking off the top portion of the ano. but it's only that center shaft area. So it sometimes make contact with the other parts of the bearing seat, but for the most part, if you're very careful, it doesn't affect how your yo-yo will play. Once I've done that, I then do it to the other yo-yo. And once I'm done with the sanding, make sure to go wash your hands, because most likely you'll be covered with a lot of dirt, a lot of part of the residue of the sandpaper, and very likely a lot of tiny bits and pieces of aluminum. Now that your hands are washed, remember that damp paper towel? Even though that you've been sanding that bearing seat away, and you could blow on it or anything, or hopefully you don't blow on it, because that means all the aluminum flakes will just fly all over the place. But there are going to be very, very tiny pieces of metal that you may or may not see. So as you notice, my bearing seat is a little shiny because I removed only the top layer of the anode. So make sure you wipe it clean. And then I have a dry paper towel. You could let it air dry, but I'm just gonna try to speed things up and actually dry it with a paper towel here. Make sure to get into all those tiny areas that water can be trapped in. Just letting you know, aluminum doesn't exactly react very much with water, unlike steel. Bearings are steel, and steel is very reactive with water. It'll most likely make it rust. So if you notice, the bearing fits really well in there now. I'll just reassemble the yo-yo. It's nice and snug. It doesn't shift or wobble. I'm not trying to force it, but everything fits very well. Okay, let's give it a throw. Okay guys, so after repairing that bearing seat, because usually some yo-yos that you get, sometimes it's not the manufacturer's fault. I mean, that does mean that they have to QC almost every yo-yo, but most of the time, sometimes some companies won't. But this is the yo-yo that you just saw. So I finished repairing the, come on, focus. So I did repair the bearing seat. Before the repair, I wasn't able to tighten it because I knew if I tightened it, it would only damage the threads. So let's see if it affected really the yo-yo. So, I don't know if you could hear that. So after the repair, it did not affect the way the yo-yo will perform. That means that there might be some yo-yos that you order that came in where it might be damaged, or sometimes it's very difficult to tighten it. So this fix I use from time to time. It only really depends how bad it is, but this is probably the third or fourth time I've done this. And so I work as a manufacturing engineer, and these are not exactly uncommon. You'll always have to deal with tolerancing. And with this slight fix, it only takes about 5 to 10 minutes. You can actually save a yo-yo if you're having some issues when you buy it brand new. Never force tighten your yo-yo. So I hope you enjoyed that. That's my first tech kind of advice, and I'll see you later.